Well, thank you all for being here today. And I know we will have a few more drift in, so make sure you glare at them uncomfortably as they disrupt us later. But I appreciate those of you who have joined us, and especially our panel. I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves and here in just a minute. But let's open with a word of prayer. God, we thank you so much that we have this opportunity to gather in your name and to listen to these stories of how you are moving in people's lives, and we pray that this will be a time when we ourselves learn and grow closer to you and to each other. In your name we pray. Amen. So today's topic, this month of August, the theme is Stories from the Other Side. That's what I've called it. Just hearing different stories from folks. Last week we had a very powerful story from Ann McMillan, who came to share with us. And this week we have 4 stories. We have lots of stories. We have 4 people who are here to talk about their experience of being a woman in ministry. And so I'm going to just start by asking them to kind of go down the line here and just briefly say, for everyone's sake, your name and a little bit, just very briefly, of kind of where you are now. And then we'll launch into it from there. All right, Jordan, I'm going to start with you.
All right. Well, my name is Jordan. I am just getting started on this path. So I actually leave on Friday for seminary. So is that everything?
Sure. Okay. Yeah. She's like Cher or Madonna. She only has one name. It's Jordan.
Would you like to share your last name?
Oh, my last name is McMahon, but it's confusing.
I'm Roselle Carr. I've been on this journey probably since childhood. I might clarify that later. But I am now youth director here at Talbot Park and loving every minute of it. Most of the time.
Loving every minute, most of the time.
My name is Nicole Farrar. I am currently a CPE resident, clinical pastoral education resident. So that means I'm working in chaplaincy at Sentara Norfolk General Hospital. However, most of my ministry experience prior to now has been in church settings. And I too feel like my ministry, call to ministry, is pretty tied to when I became a Christian, kind of back as a young person, as a young teenager.
I am Caitlin Brown. I'm the
You should, because these people are very deaf, and I cannot
I have a
overemphasize
list.
that to all of you.
I'm Caitlin Brown. I am the campus minister at the Baptist Collegiate Ministries. It's a very long title. I run the BCM or the BSU at ODU. So if you ever went to ODU or went to another college and did their BSU back in the day, that is what I do ministry with.
Oh, that's good.
Okay, cool.
We'll go right into, and I have a long list of questions that I prepared them with, and the conversation may veer in other places from there, which is fine. So, but just as a kind of opening, and some of you referenced this a little bit, I was curious about your church experiences growing up. Did you have women in church or in your family that kind of served as role models for you, or see women in your church? And then kind of your call story, how that happened, what that felt like. We'll start this way and go back that way this time. How about that?
Appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and apologize if I'm incoherent. I have a 6-week-old newborn who may start crying, and I had 4 hours of sleep last night. So we're doing good though. I felt called to ministry actually at GA camp in elementary school, but I didn't know what to do with that because the church I went to, women were allowed to work with children or be missionaries. I am very happy to have a child, but I do not feel called to children's ministry in any way, shape, or form. So I didn't know what to do with that until I went to college, and the college I went to it was sitting in a Bible class that the teacher first mentioned that women could just work at a church and be ministers and even preach. And so that was really helpful and formative for me. The first time I heard a woman preach, I was actually already working at the church. So a lot of the times I just kind of stepped out in faith and hadn't really seen a lot of things done before me, which probably means I've messed up a lot, but it's worked out so far.
So how old was that the first time you heard a woman preach?
22, I think.
And how old for Nicole?
Actually, as a child, I heard one woman preach one time, a guest preacher. When I was a child, I was attending a Methodist church. Yeah, I know, right? And so our regular pastor was away, and then a woman came to fill in, and so I did. But so this was obviously long before, I was thinking about ministry for myself. But yeah, so as a young child, one time, and then were you good? Did you have more than I then? And so then when I grew up and was kind of to youth group age at a Baptist church, that is when I started feeling a call to ministry. Although at first I wasn't sure exactly what that meant. It just kind of meant that I really loved being in church, and I took notes of the sermon and, kind of was there every time the doors were open kind of thing. And I probably thought I was more looking to marry a pastor than to be a pastor. Really, that didn't work out either, but
I'm not sure which is worse, actually.
And I was in a Southern Baptist setting, where I wasn't explicitly told I couldn't, but there wasn't really a model for it. There wasn't, in that church and even in the small town of Key Largo where I was, there wasn't any females serving in vocational ministry. So the pastors at the church encouraged me to, for example, as I graduated high school and went to a Christian college, to do that, but not explicitly, necessarily thinking that I was going into the ministry at that point.
Yes. Well, I'm somewhat older than the other three young ladies here. The first time I heard a female preacher was at a Pentecostal church. We were on vacation, and my dad always took us to different denominational settings. That was, vacation time was let's go explore. I remember she was very animated and loud. And for some other reason, I remember that the bead of necklaces around my neck broke somewhere in the middle of her sermon and scattered on the floor. So I remember her and my necklace. I also realized that there was a huge difference in the way denominations approach their spiritual leadership. We were strictly Southern Baptist, and what I had always felt was a call on my life in general from the time I was a very small child. As I went into high school, began to interest me in what form it would take. And being Southern Baptist in the early 60s, that meant no pastoral offerings of any kind. I could get a degree, I would never be offered a job in that position. Though somewhat frustrated, my feeling was that whatever God had in store for me, He would provide. The place, the time, the ministry. So I left it in His hands and ended up in music. Naturally, just doors opened and things were offered, and that's where I ended up.
And your father was also a pastor.
He was
So
a
that's
pastor
another
in a
dynamic
Southern
in that.
Baptist. Yes, yes. And when I was in high school, I wrote an editorial letter to the editor of the Baptist Standard, which is the Texas Southern Baptist newsletter, with the explanation that if there truly was no Jew, no Greek, no male, no female, no slave, no free, then women should be able to follow into ministry as the Lord leads them. And honestly, I have never been ordained formally by a church or anyone. I felt that my ordination came directly from God.
And this letter was in the 60s you wrote?
That was in the mid-60s.
Was that 1860s?
It was 1965.
So just to clarify, and you all didn't hear this at the beginning, but as part of the intro, Kaylin has grown up in lots of places because her dad was in the military, but has been in Georgia, most recently before coming, and then Texas, went to seminary in Texas, and then came to Virginia. I do think the geography plays into these stories. Nicole grew up in Key Largo, you heard Florida, Texas, which explains everything you need to know about Roselle. And Jordan, jump in.
Yeah, so the first time I heard a woman preach was, I was young, probably 6 or 7. We actually went through like an ordination process for a woman. I grew up in Virginia, in Richmond. I remember like going or like seeing her on the stage, but after like that family had left our church, it wasn't for a very, very long time after. So she was kind of like my first introduction, but she was more so, I think she got ordained like specifically to teach Sunday school. I don't know. She had been through seminary and family friend. But that was the first time I heard a woman preach, and then I think it was less, the church that I grew up in was like a little bit less SBC. They were more willing to support women and to have women in deacon roles or whatever that would look like. But my parents, however, were not on the same track that our church was. So I remember from a very young age, around the same time that I heard a woman preach, my dad told me that I couldn't because I was a woman.
So just speaking to that a little bit, because I heard a couple of different things, but for most of you, or maybe Jordan, you're the exception to this, not just that you didn't hear women preach, but there were no women on staff at the churches you were at, is that correct? No women even as deacons in the churches that you were at growing up. They were teaching Sunday school, right? They were serving on committees, often working with children. Am I missing something with any of that? But not in formal or ordained leadership roles?
Yeah, growing up, correct.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, because I'm just kind of curious about how, and Nicole, what you mentioned as far as you never explicitly were told women shouldn't do this, but you were never told women could do this either. So that's a different distinction, which, I was trying to remember. I don't know that I ever heard a sermon telling or my pastor growing up saying, oh, women can't do this, but I never saw a woman doing it, never imagined that they could, because that was just never on the
Well,
table.
we don't call you our male pastor, Aaron. I mean, female pastor Nicole, so, I mean, that'd be weird, right?
It would, yes.
I just want to ask you,
Yes.
Jordan, so what did your dad say when he came to hear you preach for the first time?
Yeah, so my story with my dad had started out really, really challenging, but it has evolved a lot by like the grace of God. When I told my dad that I was pursuing seminary, that I felt God calling me into ministry, he did not respond well. And it took almost exactly a year of my dad, I think, kind of sorting with himself and with God and doing research and studying. And about a year after I came to my dad and told him that I was pursuing ministry, he ended a phone call with just the words, I support you and I love you. And so that's been, I guess, 2 years now. So when he came to hear me preach, I don't know, like, it's definitely gotten better the longer that we've been. I think my dad was kind of forced to shift a little bit for me, and now is super supportive. When he came to hear me preach, my dad is a very analytical human, and so he took notes and criticisms, and he bought me lunch afterward and said, from now on, when I come to hear you preach, like, I'll buy you lunch and tell you the things that I think you should do better. So, but my mom and dad both have grown a lot to love and support and encourage me, which has been really beautiful to see.
So that's kind of leads right into that next questions that I have, which are, when you kind of made that initial decision, and of course, calls change, and we'll talk about that some too, whatever call means and what that looks like, but when you first publicly kind of announced, I'm interested in doing this being a variety of things, but how was that received? How did people respond, positively or negatively? You want to jump in, Roselle, with that?
My call was more into music, which was acceptable. It's interesting, I want to go back to the letter I sent to the editor of the Baptist Standard. It never got published. Well, because he sent me a letter and said, I really like your article. It makes some very valid points, but it's too long. Edit it. And I wrote back and said, if it's that good, publish it as its own article.
So what you're
Now
saying
you
is
have an
that
idea.
even in the 60s, you were as you are today. Is that
If
what
I
uneditable.
uneditable.
Yes.
Well, if I stand on the truth and it's good truth, then publish it. I could not coherently. The letters had to stand, all of it together. Sometimes when you edit, you lose the validity of what you're trying to say. So he never published it, which was fine with me. And my dad just laughed. He said, well, you're going to go there, aren't you? I said, sure. If it's worth the fight, then I will at least put forth an effort. But God, in the end, will decide which way I go. And I think it was that faith. It did not matter to me. I think one of the things that has blessed me through the years is my love of worship. And God has put me in a very special place to reach out to everybody and bring them into worship. I went through those wars in the 80s and 90s of contemporary worship, or old hymns. And my question was, why not both? I don't see a war here. I see an opportunity to reach out to every person in this congregation. And it's been an amazing journey in that respect. I still look at worship that way. And I think music is one of the major components that initially draw people into worship. I still honor the word, the sermon, that we all need to hear. But I think music is the vehicle that can call us together.
What about you, Nicole? What was the response? Were your parents just head over heels in love with this idea? Or people from your church, or people that knew you? What was that response like?
Yeah, I mean, growing up, if we're talking about high school, I think at that point it was mostly just, I didn't know what I was talking about long term. So it was kind of a one step at a time kind of thing. And so it was going to be from high school, and like I said, I'm creating founder of the high school Bible club. Of course, she's going to go to Christian college. I mean, come on now. That wasn't really a surprise to anybody. So yeah, I went to this small Christian school and was a religion major, and that was cool with everybody. I mean, that wasn't didn't ruffle too many feathers. And, my parents were just happy that I was excelling in school and, and I think for a while I contemplated doing education, many of you know my mom, she's a retired teacher, and, but I just couldn't. There wasn't, even at that point, just starting my educational journey, there wasn't anything else I could possibly conceive of that I cared enough about to invest my life studying. And so went through the religion department, and just months in, really, you realize, oh my gosh, how much I do not know. So at that point, it was like, okay, I've got to go to seminary. And I don't think my parents really knew anything about what that entailed, but I had enough of an independent streak that I was just, going to do that regardless. And so, I kind of made that happen. And when I got there, I was very fortunate at McAfee, at Mercer, in Atlanta. It was probably 50-50 in terms of men and women. And it was very much, both professors, students, and then in terms of students who kind of thought they saw themselves going into the ministry in church settings, preaching, pastoring, that kind of thing. So it was definitely a supportive environment there as I was exploring whatever I might want to do. I still didn't know what I particularly wanted. And really, even after I was done, I didn't know. I will say, and I kind of joke about it now, seminary classmates, a lot of the males seemed to think they were destined for, large pastorates, didn't really have any trouble envisioning themselves in any kind of ministry, whatever that would be, kind of just expecting that, would happen in a timely manner, and that there would be some big church out there that would hire them. It wasn't so automatically expected for the women, and in my generation, I guess, still, most of the seminary graduates, even the women, primarily found themselves in places of children's ministry, in associate roles, even though they were coming out of school with the same degrees, perhaps higher academic qualifications than some of the guys, or no church, role, and looking and doing other things while they were continuing to look. So just because your seminary environment is supportive, and just even because a church says they are, believe in women in ministry, whatever that really means, doesn't mean that when pen gets to paper, they're willing to hire you. And even the church that I served before I came to Virginia, the church in Kentucky, where I was an associate minister. Oh, and we kind of talk about titles too. I'm not sure if that was on the question list, but director of children's ministry versus pastor to children, or pastor to students, or even minister to students. That happens a lot too with women. But even that church, I found out after I left, they were looking to hire and replace their senior minister. And so I had some friends that were on the search committee there, and found out that, they had interviewed, I think they had a couple, 3 finalists, one of whom was a woman. And there was just, people that I had worked with when I was there, behind the scenes saying, if they hire that woman, we're leaving. And, I mean, I was gone, but it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking.
And it's not at all surprising. And I know exactly what you're talking about. Because at Truett, which also supports women in ministry, I remember having like an imposter syndrome, like feeling that of like, I don't know if even though my call was just as valid as all of my male classmates, I knew I had to be like twice as qualified to be considered for any job afterwards. And that was always like, just frustrating. So I made sure to try my hand in everything in ministry, because I didn't know what I would actually be able to be employed in doing. It turned out really beautiful, but I love college ministry. But I just wasn't sure for a while what or where, because even if you go to other states, there's not a lot of states that will hire females to do my role, which is annoying, but it's a thing. So ironically, my parents are here. And my dad never let me get away with saying I couldn't do something because I was a girl. So, which was annoying when I wanted to like not help move a piece of furniture or something. But it did mean that growing up in that Southern Baptist church, no one there supports me being ordained, which I am, or my sense of calling. But it also means I didn't really listen to them very well. So I know that there are people at that church who don't approve, like my youth pastor that had formed me and been really important in my life. I know he doesn't approve. But I also don't care that much anymore. Yeah, I used to. And I know that I've had lots of family members ask, like, well, why don't you also get like a social work degree so that you can have something else to do? Because my husband is he's not here because he's a young adult pastor in Newport News. Or why don't you be a nurse? Or why don't you do something else also, just in case? And that was hurtful, but at the same time, I think keeping forward on my calling, continuing to take steps forward is one of the ways I think I know the love of God better and deeper, because it's just been so much more restorative, I think, because of some of that pain. So yeah.
Well, it seems like, to me, and y'all speak to this too, that there are different levels of it. So there's some people who are just uncomfortable because they're misogynist and they don't like women in leadership roles in general. But then there's the specifically theological piece of it where people say, and this is from men and women, maybe, who say, you should not do this because it says in the Bible, and let me quote you the passage of Scripture where this is against the Bible, and so you are obviously sinning, confused, however they would, have you heard that kind of thing? What what form has that taken? So like an explicitly theological kind of, this is wrong, you must be mistaken to feel this way in your call.
I had a guy come into the museum one time and argue with me for 2 hours. I had to go to therapy after that. It was a little annoying.
A guy,
A
student,
a student brought his pastor, who was on the peninsula, so he's not in our area, down. And they're a very conservative church that he's going to.
yeah, I want these people to hear that.
Oh, sorry.
So a student brought in a pastor to explain why you were wrong.
Yes, to
Okay.
explain why I was wrong in the place of ministry that I was serving. So that was,
While you were actually.
well, I was actually serving.
And doing it well, too.
Thank you. So, yeah, he does a lot.
Yeah, I don't think had that. I'm sure the women,
By the way,
sure.
anyone who has worked in this particular building with this particular pastor, those stories are exempt from any of this discussion. I should have started that from the beginning. These are all people in the past.
Well, the person that I referred to in the church in Kentucky, that was a woman. So yes, your point about sometimes it's the women who offer the most resistance, and I don't know. I've thought with friends a lot about that because maybe because they felt callings earlier in their life and couldn't fulfill that in the way, and so they had to kind of double down on saying it wasn't right because that would be kind of what would that say about what they did or didn't do or were able to fulfill in their lives. So I'm not too sure why some of the most resistant ones can be women. I've not had anybody come in like that. But yeah, they, I guess the common verse that they would be is, the women keep silent in church kind of stuff, and that would be kind of the cornerstone of that. And yeah, no, I'll just leave it there. I haven't had anybody come quite that confrontational. Not that I can remember. Yeah.
I am surprised at the number of people who do not understand what Deborah did in the Old Testament. And when they come to me with Paul, who says women should keep silent, and I've heard this argument, women should keep silent in church, I said, well, do you want Paul's opinion or God's? I have nothing against Paul. I think he grew up somewhat conflicted at times, and it comes out in, when I read the Bible, I'm reading to find out how God works and accomplishes what he wants to accomplish. And I have to weigh what God has done and put up as examples for us against the opinions of people who came after Jesus. And I think it is confusing for people. I had family members who didn't understand what Deborah did. And this was just recently because we got into that discussion about women in ministry. I am thrilled that women today have these options. I understand that there are still roadblocks, but I think if they take the attitude I always took, which is, it doesn't matter if you call me to ministry, put me where you want me to be. And I have done youth ministry, I have done some pulpit ministry, and I have seen more examples of female pastoring in the Methodist Church. They're way ahead of, I think, the Baptists in that. But it doesn't matter if God calls us to service. He will prepare the way. And so I don't get too upset about the people who throw shade on it or don't accept it. There are some people who will never change their minds, I understand that too. And we minister to all of them. It doesn't matter what your personal opinion is about women in ministry. God calls me to minister to everybody.
But there's still a level of hurt or embarrassment or pain when people who have raised you, loved you, encouraged you, in some cases been formative in maybe how you got into ministry, and then reject you because of that. So you can't share that with them, and you want to. I mean, is that fair?
Yes, but I think it's their loss. I don't think it's, because I know that I'm called, and I know that my style of preaching connects with different types of people that maybe my husband's doesn't, because of my perspective. Some of the times I've gotten to preach on things that, well, like sexual assault in the church. I got Azalea Baptist. Anyways, let me preach on that one time, and we were talking about just like the restoration and healing, and it's something that I could get away with preaching that my husband couldn't. So I know that like our voices are different than our male counterparts, and it's their loss if they don't want to hear it. I think we are also made in God's image.
Jordan, did you want to jump in? I didn't mean to cut you off there again.
No worries. So I had two different stories. The first one, I got a cool opportunity when I was a sophomore in high school. This was before, this was when I was still, I wanted to be a pediatric surgeon for a long time. And so I was still like pursuing that and looking into like med school. But I got called to participate on a pastor search committee for our head pastor. And we actually had 3 different families leave the church for the sole reason that we were considering or like looking at resumes from women. One of the guys from the search committee like left and was not okay with that. Even just like reading women's resumes, and so like hearing that from kind of the other side of the story was really interesting. Just I was very young and didn't know how to challenge, or if I should challenge, or even really what I thought about it. But having like such disruption over considering a woman to be a head pastor was really interesting and really difficult. The pastor that we ended up hiring wasn't a good fit, and it's hard to like look back and see all these women that we didn't really look at and didn't even really pursue solely on that basis that they were female. And then, so my second story was after I had seen my call and was looking into seminary. I was talking with a friend who was also studying, taking Bible classes with me. And I was talking about the seminary that Truett, where I'm going very soon, and how they were so supportive of women, and that I was so excited about the possibility of going there. And the only things that he heard from there was like the seminary, Baptist, and supporting women. And so he his immediate thought, or the first thing he said was, well, they're wrong for being a Baptist seminary that supported women. And then he asked what I wanted to do with that, what I wanted to do with seminary. And our teacher came in and kind of saved me a little bit. But this was a trusted friend, someone that I respected a lot, and had done a lot of ministry with and alongside. Yeah, that one hurt. It was hard and difficult to kind of reconcile, this friend that I had seen do so many good things in God's name, who I had seen have so many powerful conversations and speak, and he actually got hired by the church that we were both going to several weeks after. And so I decided to step away from that church at that time. So yeah, there was a lot going on at the time, but and I had conversations with church leadership about what it would look like for me to take more of a leadership role. And I think when that happened, and when I had gotten some rejection from the church itself, I realized it was time to move on. And so I'm glad that I found you guys, though. Talbot Park has been so wonderful.
There you go. Pour it on. But it's interesting, I mean, because I think the theological piece, again, everybody has disagreements, and you might say, well, I don't like the fact that you're a plumber, but it's different when somebody says, God doesn't like the fact that you're doing this. It's not just we have a disagreement on a personal level, it's we're bringing God into it, and when you bring God into it and say, God thinks this is wrong. It's not just me that thinks this is wrong, but I'm telling you this is what the Bible says, and God is against it. That's a whole other ramping up there of that rhetoric. So it's no longer just my opinion. I'm going to use the weight of God against you. That becomes a heavy thing. We've heard some negative things. When not just when you first announced your call, but have you had positive experiences where their friends have said, we affirmed this in you, we saw this gift in you before you did, maybe, or we encouraged you? Were there people like that have been in your lives, and what form did that take? We'll start with Jordan and come back down this way.
Yeah, so the reason that I started to pursue this call was actually because of a conversation I had with a professor, a male professor. He was actually a Tibetan Buddhist, but taught a world religions course. And at the end of the class, he was like, Jordan, I see this in you. I see this calling. I see the way that you approach conversation, the way that you care for people who disagree with you, and I want to write you a recommendation wherever you want to go. Which at that point, I literally told him no. I was like, that doesn't fit in my plan. And then right after, this was such a God thing. When Caitlin actually came to ODU, was several months after that conversation had happened. And so actually in our first conversation together, sitting down to get coffee, I mentioned the possibility. I was thinking about it much later in life, was after I do the chemistry thing, I think I want to go back and do this instead. And so having that conversation with a strong female minister was really, really cool and really empowering, just to have her say, I support you, I affirm you, I see this in you, I see your heart, and I see where God is calling you. So that was a really, really cool conversation.
We're going to get all the feels here this morning, baby. All the feels up here.
Yeah. And then my sisters and, I don't know, just the most random people saw that, or have seen that I kind of changed where I was headed. And just so, it's just an outpouring. The two stories that I have that are negative, in no way compare just to the outflow of love and support and encouragement that I've received from friends, from mentors and leaders. So God is good, and yeah, I'm grateful.
Well, my story's a little different. I've been doing church music since I was probably 9 years old, playing for my Sunday school class, hymns. And it's been a progression more between God and me as opposed to institutions and me. However, and that's because women in music are a little more acceptable. At one point in the 50s and 60s in particular, churches hired men who had been to seminary and got music degrees to specifically serve as ordained ministers of music, and Bill Stewart was the last one here at Talbot Park. There was kind of a lull when he retired, and Lois Ox, who was organist, filled in for a while. I ended up coming in for a year or two, leaving and coming back, but the way I see it is that God has always been my affirmation because he was the one who put me here. And I get more affirmation as people respond to the worship that I plan. I also get more affirmation as God leads me in worship planning. I realize I don't take the normal approach to worship planning, and I've heard it before. Why do we have to sing these songs instead of these songs? And yeah, Bob and I are laughing. Because if you're crafting, it's just like the pastor who puts all of that time and thought into his sermon and the point he wants to get across. I always, even in high school, when I was subbing for the organist in our church and the pianist, I would always go to my dad and say, so what's your sermon topic for Sunday? He would always choose 1 or 2 hymns to go with his sermon topic. And I don't know if our organist, I don't think she ever thought about the rest, but I did. So I would pick the prelude and the postlude and anything in between to focus on what my dad's sermon topic was. That was a God thing, obviously. I don't know anyone else who ever did that. I did it from the beginning. So much joy comes to me when people come to me and say, I get it. I get it. I know now why you did that. The ones I have explained it to will
I wish that would happen to me one time.
Okay. I'll throw them your way this time. Yeah. And then, well, the real affirmation was when I went to work at St. Pius and ended up doing their liturgy planning. That's unheard of. They always have a Catholic person with a Catholic education degree to plan that. And I started planning after one of the nuns left. She taught me well, but she always said, I keep forgetting you're not Catholic. You get this. And I said, I know. I've been doing it all these years. The Baptists don't require it. I'm just doing what the Catholics want because God has always wanted it to be that way. So things fit together. Affirmations come. And it's a joy. My best affirmation is when the people I plan worship for respond. I like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, back to seminary and all, male and female friends, of course, classmates, you're all going through it together, but provide a lot of support, for sure, in those early years especially. And for a long time, because I didn't know exactly what direction my calling would take, I was pretty focused academically. I mean, in seminary, then, after working for a short while, I went back and pursued another degree and was kind of mid-doctoral work. And so I think when I finally kind of stepped away from the academic track and said, no, I need to be doing something that is more practical, is one of the words I used, but that would really touch people's lives in a congregation, in a church, in a local community. so when I really finally sought that out and was hired into church staff, I think my family was just so glad that I was finally in a paying job rather than like spending money on more tuition. So pretty sure anything at that point would have been acceptable and celebrated by them. But I think they support, they kind of sit back from a distance, and you know, when my family comes here, they of course would always come see me and all at the church. They probably don't understand the ins and outs and the, you know, the kind of the stories we're talking about up here, and the history and the pain and what goes into it and what the experience has been for so many women. They don't necessarily understand that. But you know, and now having just like literally right now in these last couple of months transitioned to a new ministry setting has been really interesting for me, because it is so different working in the clinical setting in a hospital now than congregational ministry. And yet I'm already feeling a lot of both of what you're saying, the inner affirmation that I kind of finally feel like I've arrived, like I've landed maybe in what I'm made to do, and then also some of the external, from when, you know, you're sitting in a room and you're holding a patient's hand and you're the only one that was there for them at 3 in the morning. When you would have rather been sleeping, but then you feel that God has placed you there for that time and that connection with that person in a way that no one else would have been able to do. And then that's all that. That affirmation will get you a long way.
When I went to college, I remember taking steps and starting to like tell people that I felt called to ministry, and it was really actually 2 men named Chris who both go to churches or work at churches that don't actually affirm women in ministry, but one was my campus minister and the other I was helping out at their youth group. And these people were just really God ordained, I guess, to be in my life, because they both just really affirmed me and encouraged me and gave me like opportunities to speak even at just a youth group, but things that I'd never seen before, and really encouraged me. And then just for every naysayer or a frustrating person I've had, there's always been at least 1 or 2 more that have been encouraging me along the way, because even after college I worked at a church and they were the sweetest, most affirming, best encouragement for going to Truett, and then seminary. All those professors they sat with me when I cried and encouraged, and yeah, I think for every frustrating person I've had 2 or 3 more who have encouraged me along the way, and I do think those people were gifts from God, just to encourage me on the path, I guess. And like people said, those really amazing ministry moments are just such a deep reminder of a sense of calling.
I think professors have been very formative, and maybe they weren't saying, oh yes, to one particular thing, but just in kind of cultivating a relationship with you, where they were supporting you, whatever, you know, just whatever you wanted to endeavor, they were just kind of behind you and saying, you know, we believe in you, and we know that you will do this and you can do this.
So, and y'all have spoken to several of these things, but Nicole, you made a comment a little while ago, you know, nobody says this is our male pastor, but we often talk about woman pastor or a woman preacher. And one of my questions was, do you think of yourself as a woman pastor or a woman minister versus just a minister or a pastor? But then also, are the expectations different, do you feel like, for you than they would be for me or for a male pastor? And what form does that take? Because I think that's part of the story that we need to hear. There are certainly overt ways in which people say, no, you can't do this, you know, explicitly. But it sounds like there are also lots of subtle ways that gets communicated in churches or with individuals. So I wonder if you'd speak to that a little bit. We'll start at this end.
Okay. women's, what's it called? Am I just like, what's the February preaching month called? There's Women in Ministry Preaching Month in February, and my preaching calendar is always full then. Not so much the rest of the year. But I usually, which maybe that tells you something out of it, so. Yeah, Martha Stearns Marshall.
Baptist Virginia Baptist, right? Or is it Baptist Women in Ministry? But anyway,
Anyways, there's a
February is
Baptist preaching
a month
and
for
that's-
women to preach.
Yeah. Sometimes it just gets annoying.
I never ask a woman to preach then, just because I never ask a woman to preach. But it has to be, I mean, I specifically don't in February because I think, it's kind of like Mother's Day. Why appreciate them one day
Yeah,
a
one
year,
Mother's Day.
so.
Also a common one.
I appreciate them every day. That's what I meant by that, all right?
I think I've had to acclimate big time. I realized a few weeks, or like right before having Basil, that I'm used to being around about 50-year-old men because as my peers, because that's the age of all the pastors that I'm friends with. I don't always know how to.
That's
hang
not
out.
the age of all the pastors. But I'm so glad that
You're glad to be the exception?
The young women.
me too, I'm around a bunch of 50-year-olds. Am I sensitive? This is not about me. Let's go on.
Get more precise with age, I guess. I don't really know. But I'm used to spending time around older pastors, and some who are really supportive, like the pastors group that I go to with Aaron, and some who are kind of mean, but I'm just used to having to hold my own. And instead of women my age, which is just kind of funny and not necessarily normal, which also tells you that I've had to adapt in that sense. So I've listened to a lot of conversations on football or something more so than I would care to.
Well, so like in church settings, how many churches would have, well, first of all, if they have, women on staff, do they have a maternity leave? Do they have policies that pertain to that? A common one is about clothing. So you get a lot of comments about how you're dressed or how your hair is or your makeup or whatever, that, I don't know, Aaron, you might not get a lot of questions about your hair.
I get some about my makeup, but not as much.
Well, okay, so, but no.
So explain what you mean by that, because some people may not
you can
be aware of
literally-
that.
You can walk out of 11 a.m. worship, this is the best, and after you having preached, and the first and only comment, someone will make is about what you're wearing that day.
Yes.
And that's a fairly common experience.
Yeah.
It's fairly uncommon for me.
Yeah.
Although when I wear a bow tie, I get a little bit
Yeah,
more.
a little bit. But yeah, so and that's one of the reasons I always prefer to wear a robe when I would preach. And it kept me warm because I don't want to get cold all the time. But yeah, so the clothing and the attire and all that, the kind of the physical appearance stuff, you probably get a lot more than the men.
Is that the same way at the hospital? So you have an outfit you wear, certain clothes that you wear that distinguish you, or a name tag or something that identifies you. You don't wear a collar.
I do not wear a collar at the hospital, although I could if I wanted to. And currently we do not yet have our jackets, which will have, embroidered like chaplain on it. So I wear regular like clothing, something similar to what I'm wearing now, and then I have a badge that says chaplain, and so people can see me coming from a distance and they can run if they want. In the emergency department, they often do because they get very, very nervous. So seriously, they'll look up with you with wide eyes like, am I dying? No, you're not. And I wouldn't be going to tell you that everywhere. Chaplaincy, that is one thing that's different about chaplaincy. Really, about half of the chaplains are women. And as my in-laws who retired from ministry told me prior to going into this, they worked both in congregational settings and in chaplaincy afterwards before they retired. They said, in chaplaincy, it's not a drawback to be female. It's often kind of not a bonus would be the right word, but it's often kind of a positive actually to be a woman in that role. Because there are just some, particularly with female patients, particularly with maybe patients of another religion, that might be more welcoming and accepting of having a woman come into the role. So yeah, I have never, I still get comments about what I'm wearing, or perhaps my age, or my hair, or something to do with how I look.
I get comments about my age too. This is not about me, let's keep
Yeah,
going.
it does sound good. But there's definitely not, there's none of the theological pushback that you get, you know, in churches. Yeah, so it's a little different now.
That's interesting. I was in a church, not Baptist, where the personnel committee had to call in one of the women on the praise team to correct her attire. That happens in music because you're not the center of attention during the sermon, so people come in for music settings, and if they're sitting on the front row of the choir and they've taken down the little curtain and the skirts don't cover everything, it's really interesting, even in music settings, even outside of pastoral settings. However, I think probably one of the biggest challenges as a woman, and this might translate into other areas, but in music in particular, there's always a question of my credibility in certain areas. I have been through 3 new sound system upgrades. This is my 3rd one. I know a lot about the new digital systems, a lot I don't know. I don't know anything about what Clifton does, that's magic. But when it comes to the sound and when it comes to the capabilities of the system, there's a lot I know that gets ignored sometimes because for some reason men don't think women understand all that fancy stuff on the sound. And I just roll with it. Eventually I figure they'll figure it out. If they would like some help, I'm there, but if not, I know the Catholic Church in particular did it while I was there, St. Pius, and they struggled. But they were very stubborn that I was not the person to help them. I'm like, okay. I had 15 hours of training before I could even touch the system in Haven. 15 hours of understanding how sound is produced, what all of the hardware is that puts it together. It was very interesting and I learned a lot. But sometimes there's just this silent bias against people with information. And depending on my schedule and how much time I want to put into it, I usually just leave it, if that makes sense. There are some things I think that aren't worth going into addressing. I'm really more concerned with personal interactions than I am with hardware and things. And I figure everything will work itself out in the end. But it is different to come into a church after, 20 years ago, at the end of a lot of full-time male ministers of music, and know how that person was treated, and then just be constantly questioned or ignored.
Well, and pay too, we have to talk about
And
pay. I mean, I
the
think-
pay is not the same.
Yeah, in Baptist life, I think statistically still female ministers are paid what, I mean, I don't know,
Less.
roughly 2/3 probably of what a male minister in their same position would make.
Well, that's.
Well, and so you go back to the titles again too, so that's a common thing.
Yeah.
If y'all missed that before, but I know in the church of my childhood, we had several women on staff that they were doing the exact same work as the people who were called ministers that were men, but they were given a title director and they were paid less.
Yeah.
And that's, for the same amount of work, the same amount of hours, but we can get away with it because we changed this title and we can justify it on the theological grounds. So that's still happening. That's the denomination, that comes into play. You've heard a lot about that. Geography, what happens in Virginia is very different than what happens in Georgia. And there are maybe 2 or 3 churches in the state of Georgia where these people could be hired in the Baptist world. There's not that many more in Virginia, but there are more. But it's night and day, I can tell you, from having grown up in Georgia or some of these other places. So that plays into it too. I'm sorry to interject, but Jordan.
So I luckily have not really had a story with this yet, within this prompt. I think I probably will moving forward, but,
Do you think of Caitlin as old as she thinks of me, is the question.
no.
No, okay. We're all separated by about 10 years, right? So,
And that's the median age. Oh my gosh.
but part of the generational thing, that makes a difference too, right? I mean, I'm kidding about that, but there is a difference
Yeah.
as things have changed in how that.
Absolutely, yeah. The only like pushback or like criticism that I've seen, like specifically for females, happened at a camp that I was working at. They pulled all the female staff together. We had a hard conversation about, we were tempting some pastors, leading them astray. So having to make sure the length of our shorts were lining up with what the Bible said. So
Where's that verse? Second Thessalonians.
Yeah, that is something I can honestly say, no one has ever said I've tempted them, not even my wife. So that is definitely a difference. We're out of time. Last question or last thought that I want y'all to address, and thank you for being willing to come here today. Thank you for being open and vulnerable about this, because some of this is not always easy to talk about. Are there ways that you wish things were different? Are there things that the church specifically could do that you think that could be supportive of, and y'all are all in different places and serving in different roles, but that's part of what I want us to be thinking about as well. What could we do differently? How could we encourage you specifically and women more generally? Start with you.
I was in a call a month or two ago where someone was talking about how there's no good pastors to hire. This was someone at the state level. And not me, but someone else jumped in and said, well, wait a second, I've been meeting all these Truett grads that are women, and they're all going to Methodist churches. They're all like super qualified. And I was like, hello, yes. But I just stayed quiet. And I think as we are entering into a new cultural era where Christendom is dying, and the churches should be more open to having women preach, teach, just do things, not be that special, I guess. Just be, because I think it speaks to my generation and Jordan's generation, and really anyone who's been hurt by the church or who has left the church for a lot of reasons. And I think it gives us a little bit of hope, and it also keeps these churches that are not able to hire someone from dying. So it meets a really practical need too. So just let us preach or teach or do whatever we feel called to when you're able. Can I give a book recommendation?
Sure.
The Making of Biblical Womanhood is a really good book that came out of Baylor.
Did y'all hear what she's saying?
Can you hear me? Sorry, I mumble
Yeah.
a lot. I know.
The Making of Biblical Womanhood?
Yes, by Beth Allison Barr. It's a really good book. She talks a lot about both the biblical history or the biblical stories of women preaching and doing things in the church, but also in church history, because a lot of the ways that church history was written, women were just written out, but it doesn't mean they didn't exist. So there's lots of stories throughout the whole 2,000 years of church history of women doing things. So it's a really good one to read, and also if you are wanting to learn more about it. So.
Hire them. Just hire them.
Interesting. I always take a more organic approach to this. I think the best way churches, I feel tremendously supported here. I always have. Well, from the congregation, I will say that. Well, I've been here twice, remember? I've been here twice. There's research.
It's not about me.
Yeah, it has nothing to do.
But we're going to have a whole separate, I'm going to the therapist.
No, I think there have been problems in the past, but that's okay. I'm back. I'm still here. I think for me, the congregation is the key. I know congregations do tend to look at pastors for leadership, and Erin is, a fantastic example of supporting women in ministry. But I also believe that congregations make a tremendous difference in what you bring to the women who are serving in your church. And that's why I said I've always felt the support of the congregation when I was here before, and now. And that's the best thing we can do. I don't know that most congregations are more supportive of women in music than they are of women pastors. And I have seen that when I have been in churches that have women come in. So, but pray about your own feeling about women in ministry. If you're struggling with it, ask God for some direction. He can give you better concepts, ideas, and feelings to go along with what He wants than I can. There's no point in us sitting up here and giving our opinions. I think the Holy Spirit really has to move and direct in these churches that are resistant to it.
Yeah, just echoing what's been already said, I think giving space for females in all areas of church. So giving space for Bible study leaders or for the opportunity to preach on a Sunday morning, those kinds of things. And then also, like resounding from Ms. Rizal, just the congregation does a lot. The congregation provides the atmosphere, provides the community, and so being intentional. I try to be very intentional with how I do my relationships, and so being intentionally supportive of women when you have opportunities to do so is helpful.
Well, as a father of a daughter who is the next generation, part of my hope and goal for Calvin Park is that we're a place where she sees and hears these voices regularly enough that if she was to feel called into some kind of formal ministry, that would be something that she would never have to question. So I appreciate y'all's witness and conversation with us this morning, and I know they'll be available here if you have questions for them just after this, but thank you so much for being here.